two of the most successful models on the planet, shaped from their teenage years under constant pressure. A mother obsessed with modeling, who turned her daughters into the most important project of her life. A little girl crying from hunger, while her mother told her to eat just a couple of almonds. A family where being beautiful was never enough. You had to be perfect. Bella Hadid admitting years later that she regretted getting a nose job at only 14 years old. Extreme diets, silent competition, and an obsession with appearance that never seemed to end. One daughter quickly becoming the favorite of luxury brands, while the other grew up constantly feeling compared. A mother correcting bodies, food, posture, even the way her daughters spoke in front of a camera.
Volleyball is a very masculine sport. Modeling is a very feminine thing.
I know.
So, you have to make a choice.
The perfect reality show on the outside, and a family dynamic that, over time, started to feel far more uncomfortable. Millions of people admiring the Hadid's perfect life, while the internet began wondering how much suffering was hiding behind all that perfection. Because maybe this story was never just about fashion. Maybe it was the story of a woman who tried to create the perfect supermodels, even if that meant controlling every aspect of her daughters' lives. And the more successful Gigi and Bella became, the harder it was to ignore the price they had paid to get there. This is Behind the Icon. And this is the story of how Yolanda Hadid turned Gigi and Bella into the perfect supermodels. Long before Gigi and Bella Hadid became global brands, there was Yolanda, a woman who had spent years obsessed with beauty, luxury, and the world of fashion. The 1990s, Europe, runways, campaigns, an industry obsessed with perfect beauty. Yolanda Hadid worked as a model during an era dominated by massive names like Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, and Claudia Schiffer. She was close to that world, but she never fully became one of the defining supermodels of her generation. She wasn't invisible, but she was never truly the center of attention either. And that matters. Because years later, many people would begin to wonder whether part of that unfinished dream ended up being projected onto her daughters. Yolanda understood that world perfectly. The diets, the pressure, the obsession with body image, the constant competition. At that point, succeeding in that industry had been her dream. Then, Mohammed Hadid entered the picture, a millionaire, a real estate developer, a life of extreme luxury. And suddenly, the perfect family appeared. Mansions, horses, cameras, money, beauty. And inside that family, two girls began growing up as if they had been made specifically for that world, Gigi and Bella Hadid. But over time, people started noticing something strange. Because more than a normal childhood, everything began to feel like preparation, a slow construction, as if Yolanda had already decided long before anyone else what her daughters were going to become. And the older Gigi and Bella got, the clearer one thing became. The Hadid story was never just about beauty, it was about perfection. As Gigi and Bella got older, something inside the Hadid household became impossible to ignore. Appearance wasn't just important, it was the center of everything: food, weight, posture, body image.
Excited about your birthday tonight?
Yeah, I'm so excited.
Fun? See all your friends?
Yeah, I'm so excited for the food. Pretty much all the food that we're eating is like a heart attack.
And then you gotta get back on your diet though.
Every detail was constantly being watched. Yolanda didn't look at her daughters like ordinary girls. She saw potential. Potential to reach the exact place where she herself had never fully arrived. And the earlier that preparation began, the better. Over time, moments started surfacing that the internet would never forget. Comments about food, strict restrictions, constant control. One scene in particular would go viral years later. Gigi calls her mother saying she feels weak, admitting she had barely eaten that day. Yolanda responds with a line that would become one of the most controversial moments in the entire Hadid story.
How are you? I'm feeling really weak. I have like half an almond. And a couple of almonds. Chew them really well because your stomach is not...
Eat a couple of almonds and chew them really well. That clip spread across TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube for years because, to many people, it no longer sounded like discipline. It sounded like something far more extreme. And while all of this was happening, Gigi's career started taking off first. More campaigns, more exposure, more contracts. Her image worked perfectly for the fashion industry. Blonde, charismatic, effortlessly commercial. Very quickly, she became part of the same social circle already dominated by huge internet and Hollywood figures like Kendall Jenner, Kylie Jenner, and Hailey Baldwin. They were suddenly everywhere together. Private events, luxury vacations, backstage at fashion shows, exclusive parties, fashion weeks. At that point, they weren't just models anymore. They had become a new generation of celebrities built to dominate social media, luxury fashion, and pop culture all at the same time. And Gigi seemed perfectly designed for that world. But while she quickly became the favorite of major brands, Bella started occupying a very different role inside the story. Quieter, more insecure, more uncomfortable. Because for years, the internet constantly compared the two sisters. And little by little, a perception began settling in. One that became harder and harder to ignore. Gigi was the perfect one, and Bella was the one trying to catch up. And that's when the story starts becoming much more delicate, because when a family turns appearance into the highest priority, the comparisons stop coming only from the outside world. Eventually, they start being felt inside the house too. But before we continue, there are 3 moments that perfectly reveal the contradictions inside the Hadid universe. First, the Chanel runway show in 2019. Right in the middle of the show, a woman suddenly walks onto the runway. The models look confused, security hesitates, and for a few seconds, the entire event feels completely out of control. Then, Gigi Hadid steps in herself. She calmly intercepts the woman, grabs her by the arm, and escorts her off the runway without losing composure for even a second. The clip instantly goes viral because it perfectly represents the image the Hadids already had at that point. Absolute control in front of the cameras, no matter what was happening around them. Second, the constant corrections about appearance. Over the years, people started noticing how often Yolanda criticized things like makeup, food, clothes, posture, even the way her daughters moved in front of a camera. Everything had to look perfect, even inside their own home. And third, Bella Hadid admitting years later that she had gotten a nose job at only 14 years old. She later confessed that she regretted doing it so young, and that statement completely changed the way many people looked back at her teenage years. Because behind that surgery, a much more uncomfortable question starts to emerge. How much pressure does a teenage girl have to feel before believing she needs to change her face that early in life? While Gigi quickly became one of the fashion industry's favorite faces, Bella seemed to fall into a very different role inside the story. Darker, quieter, and far more insecure. For years, the internet constantly compared the two sisters. Gigi was seen as the perfect California girl. Blonde, smiling, effortlessly commercial, exactly the kind of image brands love to sell. Bella, on the other hand, projected something completely different. More serious, colder, more mysterious. And little by little, an uncomfortable narrative started forming online. That Bella was constantly trying to reach something, unable to stop measuring herself against her sister's success. Some people even began wondering if Bella had intentionally built an entirely different identity for herself, simply to escape living under Gigi's shadow. And then came one of the most delicate moments in the entire story. When Bella admitted she had gotten a nose job at just 14 years old, the conversation suddenly stopped being only about beauty and became something much more emotional. What kind of pressure does a teenage girl have to feel before believing she needs to change her face before she has even figured out who she is? That's when the internet started reinterpreting everything. The comparisons, the differences between the sisters, the obsession with appearance, and the constant pressure surrounding the fashion world. Because the more perfect Bella Hadid seemed on the outside, the more people started wondering what was happening to her on the inside. And what makes the story even more incredible is that while all of these conversations were exploding online, Bella was simultaneously becoming one of the biggest models on the planet. Massive campaigns, historic runway shows, magazine covers, fashion weeks. Together, Gigi and Bella officially entered the category Yolanda had always dreamed about, global supermodels. In 2016, they made history by walking the Victoria's Secret fashion show together, becoming the first sisters ever to share that runway at the same time. At that point, there was no longer any doubt. The Hadid project had worked. But while the world celebrated their success, the internet started focusing on something else entirely. The pressure, the extreme thinness, the exhaustion, and the feeling that they were trapped inside permanent perfection. The Hadids no longer looked like ordinary people. They looked like carefully constructed characters designed to maintain an image 24 hours a day. And still, Bella kept rising. The Met Gala, Cannes, Versace, Schiaparelli, until she eventually reached one of the most viral moments in modern fashion history, the Coperni show in Paris, where Bella stood in front of millions of people while a team literally sprayed a dress directly onto her body using liquid fabric technology. The images instantly spread across the internet, and for a moment, Bella Hadid stopped looking like a model. She looked like a piece of art being created in real time. But that's exactly where the biggest contradiction in this entire story appears. Because the more admired the Hadid sisters became, the harder it became to separate where the real person ended and where the character began. And by that point, Gigi and Bella Hadid were no longer just models. They had become part of something much bigger, a new generation of celebrities beginning to completely dominate the internet, fashion, and pop culture at the same time. Kendall Jenner, Kylie Jenner, Hailey Baldwin, the Kardashians, all orbiting the same universe. Private parties, fashion weeks, luxury vacations, exclusive events, always the same names, always the same faces. And little by little, a kind of new digital aristocracy started to emerge. Celebrity daughters, nepotism, millions of followers, massive contracts. A world where walking runways well was no longer enough. Now you also had to become content. And the Hadids understood that perfectly. Instagram completely changed the industry. Suddenly, it wasn't just about magazines, campaigns, or runway shows anymore. Now what mattered were likes, followers, viral photos, and being connected to the right people. And that's when Gigi and Bella became unstoppable. Versace campaigns, the Met Gala, international magazine covers, opening and closing entire fashion weeks. At some point, they even stopped being seen simply as sisters. They became a brand. But while all of this was happening, the criticism also started growing, because the internet slowly began getting tired of something: absolute perfection. The surgeries, the filters, the extreme thinness, the feeling that everything looked carefully manufactured. And that's when Yolanda started reappearing in the conversation. Because people began looking back and asking themselves how much of all this had actually started inside the Hadid household. The restrictions, the pressure surrounding appearance, the obsession with image. Everything started being reinterpreted, especially when Bella began speaking publicly about anxiety, insecurities, and mental health struggles. Because for the first time, the perfection was starting to crack. And that's where one of the biggest contradictions in this entire story appears. Yolanda achieved exactly what she seemed to have chased for years. Her daughters reached the absolute top of the fashion world, higher than she herself had ever managed to go. But the more successful they became, the more people started asking an uncomfortable question: whether there is even a healthy way to survive inside a world that demands constant perfection. For years, the Hadids seemed untouchable, always perfect, always glamorous, always in control. But behind that image, signs of exhaustion were slowly starting to appear. Bella began speaking publicly about anxiety, insecurities, and the feeling of constantly being watched.
If you ever hear my voice shaking, it's because of my anxiety, and it's something that you have to breathe through, get it out. But a lot of that is based on mental and taking in other people's energy and letting that affect you.
In interviews, she admitted that there were moments when she would cry before going to work, and that for years she felt like she constantly had something to prove, especially inside an industry where every physical detail is analyzed: weight, face, skin, expressions, body. Everything can become a headline. Over time, the criticism online also became impossible to ignore. Accusations about plastic surgery, filters, and nepotism started flooding social media, and many people began arguing that the Hadids represented the most artificial side of the modern fashion industry. That completely changed the conversation, because people were no longer talking only about beauty anymore. Now they were talking about pressure, especially once the internet started resurfacing old clips of Yolanda making comments about food, weight, and appearance. Suddenly, a lot of people began connecting the dots, as if the obsession with perfection had existed inside the Hadid household long before fame ever arrived. Meanwhile, Gigi appeared to handle the spotlight more naturally, more relaxed, more stable publicly. Even during her pregnancy, she continued working and walking for major brands. Images of Gigi walking for Jacquemus through a massive wheat field spread all over the internet, reinforcing something important. She was still the industry's commercial favorite. Bella, on the other hand, projected a completely different energy, more distant, more fragile, more emotional. And that's exactly why so many people started identifying with her more deeply. Because behind the perfect makeup and the million-dollar campaigns, Bella increasingly seemed like the only one openly showing how difficult it actually was to maintain that lifestyle all the time. And that's where probably the most uncomfortable question in this entire story begins to emerge. How much of this life did Gigi and Bella truly choose for themselves? Yolanda Hadid achieved something incredibly difficult. Her daughters reached the absolute top of the fashion world. Magazine covers, runways, the Met Gala, Victoria's Secret, the biggest luxury brands on the planet. Gigi and Bella Hadid became the supermodels Yolanda herself never fully managed to become. For years, everything looked perfect. But behind the glamour, other things slowly started to appear. The pressure, the diets, the insecurities, and the constant obsession with perfection. Because the more famous the Hadids became, the harder it was to ignore the emotional cost of living inside a perfect image all the time. Maybe Yolanda truly believed she was preparing her daughters to succeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, the winner of GQ Hugo Boss Model of the Year, Miss Bella Hadid.
And in many ways, she did. But the question still remains, what happens when someone spends their entire life trying to be perfect, without ever having space to simply be human? This was Behind the Icon. And this was the story of Gigi, Bella, and Yolanda Hadid. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, subscribe to the channel and let us know which figure you'd like to see in the next episode. Because behind every icon, there's always another story waiting to be told.